Welcome to the video CPA. It's good to be with you today. I'm Michael Scott. I'm your host for this channel. I'm a CPA and a CMA. Have been for over 46 years now, doing tax work and accounting work as a certified public accountant. So anyway, I want to talk today about starting a sole proprietorship. And so you'll see we've got our disclaimers here. And so a sole proprietorship is the easiest type of business entity that you can set up. It's what a lot of people have if they're just working out of their home or their garage or something like that. They just kind of hang out a shingle or a sign and say, "Hey, I'm in business and I'm doing this kind of work." So it is. It's not its own legal entity. It's a legal entity that is included with the individual. Okay, so it's not a separate legal entity from the individual. It has a single owner, and it's got unlimited liability. So anything that you contract for, you're liable for in that sole proprietorship. So lawsuits, that type of thing. And that's the main drawback of a sole proprietorship, or one of the main drawbacks, is that it does have unlimited liability. Where other forms of entity organization have limited liability. We'll talk about that just a little bit at the end of this. And as we go through in the future on these different entities, I'll talk about each entity, and then we'll sum it up with a comparison of the 3 or 4 that we've got. So anyway, single owner, unlimited liability. Now, how do you set one of these things up? These things are the easiest thing to set up. You really, depending on the state that you're in, you don't need to get any permission from most states. You don't necessarily need a DBA, which is doing business as. You may need, depending if you're in a service organization or something like that, you might need a license from the state. For example, a CPA needs a license from the state. Certainly lawyers do. I think a lot of professions like hairdressers, a contractor probably needs a license locally. So there may be some licenses that you need to get to be in business, but those would be necessary regardless of the type of entity that you're setting up. Okay, you may need an employer ID number if you have employees, and if you do have employees, you'd need one for the feds and the state. Okay, just remember that in a sole proprietorship, the owners are not employees, so you don't just because you're there working, you don't need a federal ID number. You can use your social security number. Now, it could be that a bank insists that you have a federal ID number before they'll set up a bank account for you. And in that case, get one. They're pretty easy to get. And I do have a video in this series out on how to get a federal ID number. So just if you need one, just watch that, because you can get one within 20 minutes almost off the internet. All right, you might need a sales tax number. So if you're selling merchandise, you'll probably need a sales tax number. If you're doing services, you may not. So you need to look at that. That's a possibility. Now, I recommend getting a business bank account. Some people do not do that, but a business bank account is a control function on your business. And so if you'll run everything through that business bank account, it keeps a record of everything that you're doing. And then certainly if you have cash outlays, keep the receipts on those. But if you're writing checks or if you have a credit card on the business bank account, it keeps track of all those transactions. And so it's much easier to do your accounting, especially if you don't have a business bank account and you're intermingling your business transactions with your personal transactions. It creates quite a headache, and you can expect it if you get accounting to be done by a professional, it's going to cost you quite a bit more. So I recommend getting a business bank account when you set up a business. And I recommend getting some kind of accounting system, whether that's a manual accounting system where you record your transactions, or it's QuickBooks, or it's a Sage product, or a lot of other products on the market now that are good accounting systems. But those are the minimum requirements, I think, to set up a sole proprietorship. So they can be set up pretty fast. I mean, you can decide that you want to go in business on Monday and be in business by the end of the day, Monday or even or Tuesday possibly. So it does not take long to set up a sole proprietorship. Other items that you might need, certainly, if you've got a business location, you might need an office location. You need computers. You need inventory if you're selling inventory. You need furnishings, letterhead, signage, maybe business cards, things like that. But those things you need with any business, especially if you're not working out of your home and if you've got a separate office. But just getting a sole proprietorship off the ground would be those first 6 things that you need to look at, and that's your minimum, and those things can be done pretty quickly. All right, how's a proprietorship tax? So let's look at this. We're gonna, like I say, we'll go through a partnership, and we'll go through LLCs, and we'll go through corporations, and talk about how they're taxed, and then we'll compare everything at the end of this series. But a proprietorship, as I mentioned, is not its own legal entity. It's combined with the owner. So proprietorship income is actually added into your other income. If you've got a spouse that's working at a W-2 type job, your income is added into their income. If you're working at a W-2 type job, same type of thing. Or if you've got interest income or something like that, all that stuff is added together for a proprietorship. So a proprietorship actually files what's called a Schedule C, which is a business schedule, and it's attached to your 1040 personal income tax return. So you complete the Schedule C, which is a listing of your revenue and your expenses, and it comes down to a net income figure. And then that net income figure or loss is included on your 1040. And that's the way that you actually calculate your tax for tax purposes. But there are 2 types of taxes that are due on a proprietorship. And one is income tax, and the other is what's called self-employment tax. I do have a video on self-employment tax that will talk a little bit more about self-employment tax. But self-employment tax is basically Social Security for a individual that's self-employed. When you work for a corporation on a W-2 type job, they pay Social Security for you. They pay half of it, and you pay half of it. So they take that out of your check. Each time you get a check, you're paying Social Security out of that check, and they're matching that. Okay. If you're self-employed, there's nobody that's going to match that for you, and so you have to pay both sides. And so instead of paying roughly over 7.5%, you end up paying over 15%. So if you're self-employed, which is pretty burdensome for self-employed individuals, especially if they don't know anything about it and they come up to the end of the year and they haven't made very much money, but they owe all this self-employment tax. So 2 types of taxes, income taxes and self-employment taxes. And again, if you're not familiar with self-employment tax, watch my video on self-employment taxes. All right. And then again, if you've got employees, you will also be responsible for filing quarterly payroll reports and paying payroll taxes for those employees. And in this case, you'll be matching part of that Social Security on their tax returns. So you'll be withholding income tax withholding, you'll be withholding Social Security, and then you'll be matching that Social Security. And you'll also probably be paying state unemployment taxes and federal unemployment taxes. So a proprietorship, and it doesn't really matter with the entity, the payroll taxes are about the same with every entity that you've got, except with a proprietorship, the owners are not employees. so they're treated a little bit differently. But the payroll taxes are about the same, regardless of entity. All right, let's look at what the advantages and disadvantages are of a proprietorship. All right, they're easy to start up. I mentioned that. You've got low administrative costs. With a proprietorship, I mean, you have to file a 1040 every year generally, and that 1040 is, you just have to put a Schedule C with it. That may require you to have a paid tax preparer, because Schedule C can be complicated, and especially if you've got depreciation and auto expense and those type of things, it gets a little bit more complicated. So there may be a little bit more administrative costs, but you don't have to file a separate tax return like you do with a corporation or a partnership, and so it's cheaper in that regard. All right. The other thing is you have complete control, and you control the business. You do what you want, and that's good sometimes, and it's got a downside too that we'll talk about in a minute. All right, the disadvantages of a proprietorship, the unlimited liability is the big disadvantage. And then again, you've got complete control. You're the main person. If you get sick, there's no income being produced by this proprietorship unless you've got employees out there that are well trained and they can go out and produce income for you. But a lot of times, if you're the main person, you're working a lot of hours. It's hard to get away. Hard to even take vacation sometimes. So that's something that you need to think about. And you know, if you're a small business owner and you're making money, there's nothing better. But if you're a small business owner and you're just scratching by, it's a very tough way to live. So I used to think when I was younger that working for a corporation was almost like being a slave, you know, but there are a lot of advantages to it. I've done both. I've had my own businesses, and I've worked for corporations, and I'll tell you, I love having my own business, but there have been situations when I have not liked it because I was just scraping by and could hardly pay the bills. So you need to think about those kind of things. But proprietorships, like I say, they're generally the way you start in business. There is a point in time when you've got a proprietorship that you might want to switch over to another business entity. But when you're first starting out, I would start out as a proprietorship. And there's a lot of people out there that when you're starting business will tell you, well, you need to be an LLC or you need to be a corporation or something like that. And you may well be at some point in time. You might need to be, but not when you're starting out. So you can probably run several years like this, and until you're making quite a bit of money. And so good way to start a business, good way to continue with the business for a couple of years anyway. All right, so that's it. Let's look at alternatives that we'll talk about in the future. We're going to talk about partnerships. We're going to talk about C corporations, S corporations, and limited liability companies. So those are alternatives to a sole proprietorship. And they've all got their advantages and disadvantages. So we'll talk about those in the future. Anyway, I want to thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, please do so. If you've got any questions, leave them in the comments section below. I try to answer all the questions. I've got a couple out there that I haven't answered yet because I got COVID, and it's really put me behind the 8 ball on doing some of this stuff. But I will get to them. I promise you that. So anyway, thanks again for listening.